Yo guys, and welcome back to another week of me building a self-tracking app in Svelte 5. And in this week I pretty much finished off this onboarding system, which will just create a bunch of entities in the system for the user so that they don't have a completely empty slate to work with, so that they get a small little tutorial before jumping into the action. One small change that I implemented is that I made some of these trackables default so that they can actually not choose to remove them. These will always be created when the user is onboarded. And the reason for that is so that I can actually create a sensible dashboard for the user. So now when I onboard in this system, you can see that we actually create a dashboard for the user as well. And I think this looks pretty decent. I got all of the basic trackables that I imagine most people would be interested in having. So we have the sleep, the steps, the energy levels, and then we have two entry row widgets here where you can start tracking your mood very easily. We can see that this is immediately reflected in the chart here. We can have this table which has group by as well, grouping by the meal type here, in this case dinner. We can also track our hydration. These icons are not complete, by the way, but we have some basic suggestions for these drinks. We also have a nice little chart down here. If I wanted to track different food types, I could track chicken and lunch. Here you can see that we now have two entries in the pie chart. We could of course track more meat, and then it would have a greater frequency in the pie chart. And we also have some goals, two goals, daily steps, and another compound goal which actually combines the daily steps and good sleep. So if I were to track about 7,000 steps, we can see that this is now completed here. And if I also track some good sleep, I slept for 8 hours this day, then we can see that this is now also completed. So we have a nice little suggestion goal for the user so that they can just get started and see an example of how the goal system is working. They can just go in here and delete them if they want to, or modify them, take a look at them, see how they work underneath. I think it's a good way to introduce the system to the user. So now we actually have a proper finalize method in our code where we finalize the onboarding state based on what the user has selected as their suggestions. But of course we also have the default selections that they cannot get rid of. So for all of these selected trackables and tags, we actually create them in the system and stored them in the database. So here we just loop over those and create a trackable from the suggestion. And the same goes here for the tag. But in order to actually create a dashboard, we need to know what the IDs were for these trackables. If we take a look inside of these trackables, we only reference them by their name. We have the food here, for example. We don't have an actual ID because that will be generated uniquely on the fly when we create this trackable. So we actually set the suggestion name here and save off actually what the created IDs were. We have the trackable and the form that was created, and also the assigned question. So this is the question ID. If we have a question ID here that says perhaps meal type, this actually gets a random UUID. So we need to know what the actual ID of it is. But then down here when we actually create the dashboard, we send in these created trackables so that the dashboard function here knows what the IDs of these form questions were. So if we take a look inside of the dashboard suggestions, we can see that we actually reference them by these name here that we have. If we have food, well, then we reference that by that name. Then it will be replaced with the actual UUID that exists in the database. And here we also check with capacitor. If we are on a mobile device, we of course need to create a different layout for the default dashboard. Another change that I implemented this week was to massively refactor this app.ts. Before we actually had all of the initialization logic put in this app.ts. It was getting huge and massive, and it was really difficult to actually find where things were created. Now we pretty much have only the basic fundamental functions of the application, and this is pretty much the main function where the app is started. We actually have sequential logic here with async, so we can actually await these things. We need to make sure that some of these things happen before other things happen. So the first thing we do here, for example, is set up the DB, which just creates all the Dexy collections, sets up the Dexy stores, and then we actually create the services. So I move this to a separate file where we have a services interface that just stores all of the services in our system and creates them, initializes them. It's pretty much the same logic, but we have it a bit more tidied up in a different separate file so that we can now see that this is all the things that are related to the services and initializing them. When we then have access to our services, we can then inject them into the stores themselves. So here we have to do things a little bit differently, since these stores need to be available to our Svelte components. We need to actually export these as variables, but they will not be set immediately. They will actually be set down here in setup. So we have a store provider that we actually create with the data that we get from the services. So we create a new store provider. In fact, here, setup stores takes in the services, creates a new store provider, and then sets them up with the actual dependencies that they have, in this case, the services that they have, and other forms of dependencies. I also implemented a database migration service. So this is when we make changes to our data model. If we were to add a new field to our trackables, perhaps we want to track something else on the trackable, give it another icon or a different property, well, then we need to also update that in the database. Otherwise, we're going to be fetching objects and we're trying to access these properties. They won't exist on these objects because they have not been modified in the database. So what I did was actually create a migration service that will be able to migrate different objects based on a bunch of rules. In this case, we actually have a migration already, since I added titles to my charts this week as well. So we have a charts title migration. And what does this do? Well, it just checks if this is a chart dashboard widget. Well, then it will add a new title property, and this did not exist in the previous version. And the way this works is that it stores the current data version here. This is the most up-to-date data version. This is what we expect all entities to have. And then we actually store the user version in local storage. So we might store something like 10 in the local storage, but then we make some changes. The user reloads the page. We have pushed those changes. We say that the current data version is now 20. Well, then we need to update. We can see that the user is behind. They need to migrate their databases. So we just loop over and find all the migrations that occurred between the current user version and the actual data version that is most recent. And then we just apply all of these migrations to the database. And then we say that, yeah, this user has now been migrated, and we store that in the local storage. Another massive refactor that I did this week was to actually use callback functions in our form editor view. So instead of having a bindable in Svelte, which is quite difficult to work with, we're using immutable data. We're sending in data like the current question. So if I change something here in the form editor, if I change the min value of this number, previously we used Svelte bindable, so that it would actually bind this input field to the object itself. It would mutate the actual object under the hood. And this is quite difficult to reason about. I've actually come to enjoy working with immutable data instead. So what I do instead is I send a callback. I tell the parent component, hey, this is the new object. Instead of modifying the actual property, we return a completely new object reference that has just this value updated. So how does this look? We can see if we take a look inside of the edit number question settings, we can see that instead what we do is just pass in the value settings.min, pass in the value, And then we have an on change. So whenever this actually changes, what we do then is call this on change method instead. So it will spread this object and add or update this property. It will not actually update or mutate the actual settings object. What it instead will do is send a completely new object. So it will have a completely new object that just has this max value property set to the value that we had from the event handler here. And immutable data is way easier to reason about. It's much easier to reason about than having these weird random changes in the objects, mutating objects from different places. I've just come to appreciate actually working with callbacks and sending the data as it is. Of course, there is a little bit of a performance downside to this. We're creating a completely new object. Instead, we could be just mutating it. It would actually be a little bit less expensive, but it's way easier to reason about. And pretty much every other place in the code base is using callbacks. So I'm not really sure why I modeled just the form editor view to use Svelte bindable, but in this case, it's just way easier to use on change handlers. And this also fixed a bunch of bugs because some of the data was expecting it to be immutable and some of it expected it to be mutable. And modifying these things, we got some really weird bugs. I had no way of knowing where the data was changed from. Now it's way easier to reason about. I can just say that, oh, we get an on change from our data settings. Then we have on data settings changed. Then we just say we create a new object of the current question where the data settings have been modified. And then we just say, oh, the question has changed. Well, then we just say that this has changed. And in the form editor view, we just replace the whole form question with the question data that was sent in the callback. Another small little user experience fix that I added was so that we can actually have a bit more space underneath the dashboard set so that the user actually has space to add new widgets. I realized when I was creating this onboarding dashboard that we couldn't actually add a new widget at the bottom because it was already using all of the available height. It wasn't actually giving some padding. But now if I pull out some widgets, you can see that we actually have some space to work with. We can create a bunch of widgets here without any issue because we have some padding to work with. And this was quite easy to implement with the help of GridStack because it has this in-row property, which just says to GridStack, hey, I expect that this grid at least contains this amount of rows, which will control how high it is. So when we create this GridStack grid, we simply check with all of the widgets and we find the widget that has the largest Y value and also, of course, the height. If it's down here, well, then it will also give more space. It will use more space. So we kind of get this value down here where it ends. So from that, we will calculate the max Y and then we add 10 to that so that we have 10 rows of extra padding to work with. So that is all that I had time to implement for this week. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video and that you perhaps learned something new. So I would say that the system is coming along nicely. So now that we have an actual onboarding system, we can almost start inviting users to test the app out, which I'm really happy about. So we're getting pretty close to releasing an MVP, a minimum viable product for this app that we have actually been working on for a bunch of weeks. If you want to check out the source code and see how it has evolved from day one, you can do so on GitHub. I have posted the link in the description. I also have a link to my Discord channel if you want to join that and be part of the community that I'm trying to build. But other than that, I will see you guys next week. Peace out.